We're continuing to look at Standard 7, World War II and the Cold War. We pretty much already talked about World War II. We've also discussed how the Cold War kind of started during World War II. Today we're actually going to talk about the Cold War and how the impact of the Cold War on national security led to changes in individual freedom. We're also going to talk about the containment policy and the role of military alliance, the effects of the Red Scare and McCarthyism, conflicts in Korea and the Middle East, the Iron Curtain, the Berlin Wall, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the nuclear arms race. This is a really big standard, and it's a really important standard. We've seen where World War II was fought to stop Nazi aggression and to preserve democracy in Europe. We also saw that it made allies of the United States and the Soviet Union. Of course, there's that famous quote by Winston Churchill I told you before that said, "My enemy's enemy is my friend." So even though the fact we really don't consider ourselves that close to the Soviet Union, during World War II we were allied together out of necessity. And it's not a natural alliance. The United States is democratic and capitalist, while the Soviet Union was totalitarian and communist. There are different wartime priorities, like we saw in Standard 7.4. Those conflicting ideologies and the wartime priorities over the course of fighting during World War II laid the foundation for post-war tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union, and is going to lead to the Cold War. And really, the fact the U.S. takes so long to open a second front is going to cause a major problem. The post-war goals were also at odds. The Soviet Union wanted a buffer zone of friendly states on its eastern border. They had been attacked by Germany twice in the 20th century, and they wanted to ensure that that didn't happen again. So the buffer states would protect them from a direct attack by Germany. And those are included over here, the picture on the right. You see, or both those pictures actually show who those buffer states would be. And these would be communist governments that would protect the Soviet Union. However, the United States has different goals. The United States wants those countries that we just looked at to be able to hold free and fair elections. The Soviets promised this, but the elections they held were not free, nor were they fair. All the buffer states set up communist Soviet-controlled governments. The United States has traditionally been a supporter of democracy, and you can see that theme running through the Cold War and into our conflicts today. But you can also see that the U.S. will support non-democratic governments when it supports our interests and when it helps our interests. The U.S. supported the efforts of other wartime allies to continue their influence in other regions. We helped the British prop up the autocratic government in Greece that was in danger of falling to a communist-leaning rebel force when the British became unable to do so. The common theme during the Cold War. This is really important to understand the common theme. The United States supports non-democratic governments when they are fighting communist forces. Thus, we see the greatest threat to freedom as communism. So we'll support bad dictators in places around the world as long as they are not communist. An example of that is with the French. The French attempted to restore their control of Southeast Asia after World War II. During World War II, Vietnam and the areas around it had been taken by the Japanese. After the war, the French wanted to restart or re-control it. They met a lot of resistance from nationalist forces that had fought the Japanese. Those forces were led by a communist leader named Ho Chi Minh. The real reason the U.S. doesn't support Ho Chi Minh and doesn't get the French to back off is because Ho Chi Minh is a communist. They'd rather Vietnam be led by a dictator than by a communist leader like Ho Chi Minh. So France asked for support from the United States, and that's going to lead to our involvement in the Vietnam War, which we'll discuss in the next standard. There's also a struggle we misunderstand. The Vietnamese are fighting for independence. They'd fight against the Japanese, the French, and later the U.S. for their independence, as they saw it. They were fighting against the other people as invaders. We were fighting against Vietnam because they were a communist threat. So to sum it up, as a result of wartime and post-war circumstances, the United States became involved around the world in containing the communist threat. That's the key word we'll talk about. The tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union, they're publicly recognized in 1946. Winston Churchill gives a famous speech where he says an Iron Curtain had descended upon Europe, which cut off Soviet-dominated Eastern Europe from the West. And so you see that with the red and the blue pictures right there. And so the red pictures are the communist states and the blue are the not communist. And it says the Iron Curtain has descended between them. The United States began to formulate a policy of containment. This is another important post-war or another foreign policy thing that you need to know. It's called containment, and this is part of the Truman Doctrine. What the Truman Doctrine said was they pledged to contain communism in Europe. So internationalism were involved around the rest of the world. It was first applied when the U.S. supplied military and financial aid to Greece and Turkey to resist the communist-backed forces there. Um, to understand containment, think about what a container does. It holds something in. So the whole purpose of containment is to hold communism to keep it from spreading. Notice that the goal is not to rid the world of communism, but to stop the spread of communism. Most U.S. conflicts during the Cold War fought for this reason, to stop communism from spreading. That's true in Korea, it's going to be true in Vietnam. The way the U.S. looked at the world and at world events would be shaped by fear of the spread of communism, their goal towards stopping the spread of communism. So you can see in this picture, there's this world struggle between the Soviet Union and the U.S. trying to spread our beliefs. U.S. trying to spread democratic beliefs, Russia trying to spread communist beliefs. And here's another picture showing the two different alliances, and it's really like an us versus them around the world. The U.S. feared a war-torn and economically weak Western Europe would elect socialist, communist governments, so they offered financial aid to promote economic rebuilding and prevent the fall of European countries to communism. This is called the Marshall Plan. The U.S. gives lots and lots and lots of money to Europe so that Europe can rebuild after the war. The Soviet Union is actually kind of angry over this because none of that aid was offered to the Soviet Union formally, although the Soviet Union would have declined it if it had been offered, but it's still on the whole posturing thing. So Marshall Plan is going to cause some problems between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. You can see some of the pictures down there, how much money was given to Europe. There's a lot of those countries get a lot of money from the U.S. to help rebuild. One of the cities that does get rebuilt through the Marshall Plan is Berlin. What's really interesting, or something you really need to know about Berlin, is it had been divided at the end of World War II. You had 4 sections of Berlin, just like you have 4 sections of Germany. There's one section that's controlled by the Soviets, and then 3 sections. One's controlled by France, one's controlled by Great Britain, and one's controlled by the U.S. So really what happens is you have the East, which would be the Soviet-led one, which is communist, versus the West, which is kind of controlled by the U.S. or one of the Allies. So it's communism versus non-communism in Berlin and Germany. The same thing happens there. The USR, I told you the Soviet Union had already been invaded twice by Germany, and so they're alarmed at the prospect of a strong Germany. That's why they had decided to split it into 4 so it wouldn't become so strong. At one point, they also imposed a blockade on West Berlin, cutting off all land and rail routes into the western sectors. And this is a major Cold War event. The Western Allies ended up responding immediately by mounting a tremendous airlift. And this is a major victory for the U.S., the Berlin airlift. Not only did the blockade turn out to be totally ineffective, it ended up backfiring on the Soviets in other ways. It provoked genuine fear of war in the West, and instead of preventing the establishment of independent West Germany, it accelerated the Allies' plans to set up the state. It also caused the U.S. and its allies to create the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was an American Western European military alliance, which was aimed to protect them from the Soviet Union. And so here are some pictures from the Berlin airlift. Berlin later became the symbol of the Cold War because the Soviets built a wall through Berlin. It was to keep people from going from the east to the west of Berlin. Because in the West, they would have been free and away from communism, and the West was a lot more profitable and a lot more opportunities in the West than there were in the East. And so they built this wall to keep people from crossing over. Notice how the purpose is to keep people in, not allowing them to escape. East Berlin, like Eastern Europe, was not free. It was not democratic. People there lacked the basic freedoms that we enjoy. Those in East Berlin would travel to the free West Berlin, and from there they would be able to travel freely to West Germany and freedom. The talent that lived in East Berlin was living and taking with it all the advantages that the Soviets needed to rebuild. So that's why the Soviets built the wall. They were tired of people going from one side to the other and escaping. And so here's some pictures of them building the wall. This becomes the ultimate symbol of the Cold War, that wall around West Berlin. Let's get into some timeline of the Cold War events. First, in 1949, NATO is created. That's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It was formed by the United States as a military alliance aimed at the Soviet Union. The countries in blue are part of NATO. There was a test explosion of an atomic bomb by the Soviet Union in 1949. It's going to lead the U.S. to speed up development of the hydrogen bomb, which will be even more deadly and more effective, and begins a nuclear arms race. Also, China had been engaged in in a civil war between 1945 and 49. The United States backed a nationalist leader, a guy by the name of Chiang Kai-shek, against the communist forces led by Mao Zedong. The nationalists ended up losing to the communists in 1949. This is a failure of containment, and it looks really bad on Truman. In fact, a lot of people in the United States say that Truman lost China. And Mao ends up leading China. China's still communist to this day. Mao's considered to be one of the greatest leaders in all of history. In 1950, communist North Korea invaded South Korea. We look at it, the U.S. looks at it through the lens of the Cold War, and we see a communist country invading a non-communist country. And so with the containment policy, U.S. has to step in and stop it. This is the first military action of the Cold War. American troops are used. Sometimes the Korean War is thought of as a forgotten war because we don't really put a lot of emphasis or remember it all that much in the United States. There's some early back and forth across the 38th parallel. North Koreans end up invading, pushing the U.S., South Koreans all the way down to almost the very end. When the U.S. pushed back, and General MacArthur comes up with this brilliant strategy where he's going to land at Incheon. It's a huge military victory, and would push the Koreans all the way back to the Yalu River, which is the border between North Korea and China. Pretty much won the war completely there, but then the Chinese come across the border and push the U.S. forces back to the 38th parallel. And that's actually where it pretty much ended and is still there to this day. In fact, North Korea is still communist, South Korea is still not, and it's still in the news today. Like I told you in the last unit with Dennis Rodman going over to North Korea and it being a big deal. In 1955, the Warsaw Pact was organized by the Soviet Union. This is a military alliance of Eastern European nations for the defense against NATO. It's the opposite of NATO, Warsaw Pact versus NATO, and you see the two sides right there, the blue and the red. Then the space race starts up. We're creating these new bombs that are so deadly they have to be delivered by missiles, and so the space race is necessary because you're developing rockets that could then deliver the bombs. The Soviets launched Sputnik, which was this little, about basketball-sized satellite up into space. That's going to cause a lot of problems in the United States. In the United States, we're going to think that the Soviets are spying on us. We start to think that we are behind the Soviets. And so the U.S. Congress actually passes the National Defense Education Act, which is to promote science and math skills in school, because they feel that consumerism has made Americans less competitive and less likely to win the arms race. So we need some of our best and brightest to become scientists and mathematicians to help us defeat the Soviets. There are other events in the 1940s and 50s that are going to lead to the second Red Scare. Remember, red is the color of communism, like the fall of China, Soviet acquisition of the bomb, the Korean War. So it's going to look like there are spies throughout the United States, which is causing the United States to lose some of these major battles, major events. Truman administration had this like tough, simplistic talk about communism, and we looked at it as like really good versus evil, good being us, evil being the communist. And like I said, he had to come out strong against communism because of all those events happening. It looks like he's soft on communism, and that's going to be a major problem for future presidents. They're going to be worried about being seen as being soft on communism. There's a lot of propaganda in the Cold War, a lot of anti-Soviet media that permeated the culture of the United States, and I'll show you some pictures. Shows really that the Soviets, we got to be really careful that we might fall to communism too, and could create like a major problem. At that point, Republicans began to accuse Democrats of being soft on communism. Many people blame partisan politics and a Republican desire to gain the White House, and so they started saying that that Republicans were stronger on communism than Democrats. And there are some spies in the government at that time, but this guy by the name of McCarthy is going to come around, and he's going to start accusing people of being communist, and that's going to lead to this like witch hunt and this fear. And I'm going to talk about Joseph McCarthy a little bit more as I continue the video because I pretty much run out of time for this one. I will start over in just a minute.